Welcome to Real Rockford Files, for tales of the paranormal, supernatural, and the flat-out unbelievable. Today I'm going to be sharing ghost stories from Maine. Let's get into it. Story 1. My friend Margaret, she's in her late 80s, is experiencing some problems. She loves dolls. She just bought a ton of dolls at an auction. They were from around the early 1800s. A couple nights ago, she had them all spread out on her dining room table, and she left them there when she went to bed. About 12 that morning, she heard a noise, and she woke up and got out of bed to go see what it was. As she walked through the hall and into the dining room, she saw a little boy sitting at her table. She walked a little closer and saw that the whole side of his face was burned, like maybe he had been caught in a fire. So she started shaking her cane at him and started yelling at him, saying things like, "Who are you? What are you doing in my house?" and so on. The little boy looked up at her, stood up, then disappeared. This, of course, startled her, and she spun around to go back through the hall. Now her den is right next to her dining room. As she spun around, something caught her eye in the den. She looked in again and saw a man standing above her coffee table, looking at something. She started yelling again, and the man immediately disappeared. Okay, that was a couple nights ago. Now last night she was sleeping, and around 5 a.m. she heard a noise and woke up again, this time to see a young lady in a pre-Civil War type skirt, full length and such. The lady had a small, fine paintbrush in her hand, and it looked like she was painting the mirror that Margaret has on her wall. Margaret started yelling at her, and she disappeared. She eventually fell back asleep. When at 7 a.m. she woke up and saw a young black girl, about 14 maybe, standing at the end of her bed. She was wearing the same type of dress. The girl looked like she was looking down at something near Margaret's feet. Again, Margaret yelled at her, and the ghost disappeared. She's pretty freaked out, and she can't figure out why this is happening. I think it has something to do with the dolls. That day after the sighting of the little boy and the man, she packed all the dolls up and put them away in a spare room. I think these ghosts might be the owners of these dolls, and they're just looking for them. We have tried to convince her that she needs to try to talk to them, but she refuses. Story 2. Once I lived in this house in a small town in Maine. It was an older house. I did not know any history behind it, and most likely never will, but it was an older house. We had a basement and 4 rooms, the usual old house style. The kitchen is where most of the abnormal activities would take place. Our front door had an entrance with another door, a heavy wooden door with glass window. The way the door sat, you would have to push hard to open it, and then you would be in a small porch type which led to the front door. Quite often the front door would swing open, but yet the outside door would remain closed. You could sit in the living room and watch our kitchen light turn on and off. The kitchen light we had was old-fashioned. It had a fluorescent bulb with a metal pull string. Once you pulled the string, it came on. Well, my mom put a piece of yarn on the metal string so us kids could reach it. You could actually watch that string being pulled. This happened every night, and we got used to it very quickly. I've always assumed that the presence was an old lady, and so did my family. We have no idea why, we just felt that. Us kids would go to bed with our windows open and blankets off, because in the middle of summer it gets hot. We would wake up, our windows closed, and bundled up in blankets. Now, we had talked to my parents about it often, and they said we were at that age, so they didn't even need to check on us. We were never frightened by any of this. It all became normal, even to our friends. But one day, I will never forget any of this. My mom went to go turn on the kitchen light, and the yarn on the end of it. She went to turn it on, and she was shocked so bad it dropped her to her knees. Now, I really am not sure, but I am almost positive that you cannot get electrocuted by yarn. A while after that, we moved. We just figured that she liked to play with us. It seemed like she was like to tease us. Story 3. When he was young, my grandpa, he was a wild man. He drank all the time and cussed. Him and his cousin Wade were going coon hunting on an old road that they lived on. It was out in the middle of the woods. As you know, it's dark when you go coon hunting. Well, my grandpa and Wade were driving my grandpa's car. It was a piece of junk. It quit, and they were in the middle of the woods, trying to work on the car. The only light they had was a lighter. It was almost out of fluid. My grandpa was mad and cussing, and Wade told him there was something coming up here. My grandpa told him to shut up, and hold the lighter still, but Wade dropped the lighter and jumped in the car. My grandpa turned around and saw two yellow eyes floating toward the car. He yelled and jumped in the car with Wade. The eyes circled the car over and over. This is true. My grandpa was a Christian and wouldn't lie. Story 4. My dad had heard voices in the basement. He said that he had heard the voices saying things like how his life had been, sort of like a storyline of his life. Me and my cousin wanted to explore the subject further, so we brought a camera downstairs. I took pictures everywhere in my basement. On the top of the stair rail, there was a faint marking made by a pen. If you look at it closely, you see that it said, "You took it off." I couldn't believe it. There was a small hand-shaped sticker with fur stuck to the wall of the basement when we first moved in. My dad or mom must have took it off because it wasn't there anymore. The ghosts didn't like that, so they found a way to tell us. One of the pictures we took on my camera actually moved. It wasn't a recorded movie, just a picture. It moved by showing a shadow coming closer and the air getting foggier. Another picture showed a blue tarp that was there hanging, like always, but another picture of the same tarp showed the tarp hanging from one strand. I took a picture of a wall, and it came out on my computer and camera as a face close-up, showing a nose and eyes. It was a gray and slightly see-through face. The last thing that happened was that my cousin took a flashlight and shined it at a white piece of paper. She took the flashlight away and then put it back. A quarter of the paper was missing. Later that week, I was the only one downstairs on the downstairs computer, and I heard an old woman's voice calling, "Bradley, Bradley, Bradley." Please tell me what you think. Are there ghosts in my basement? Story 5. I have been a stay-at-home mother for over a year now. We bought and moved into our first home, a nearly new, only one previous owner who owned it for a couple of years, mobile home in a very nice community. I've never ever heard of a mobile home being haunted. Of course, I do know that land can be haunted. I have done a little bit of research and found that the 25 years this community has been there, the lot that we currently occupy has been vacant until our home was put up in 2002, which is strange because it's a corner lot and could have easily accommodated a home. We bought this place in March 2006. I had an uneasy feeling from the first night, like someone was watching me from the hallway. Exactly 1 week after moving in, I gave birth to our first and only daughter, who is now 15 months old. About a month later was the first time I heard it, which is when my husband started working overnights. I was going to sleep, and at 2:30 a.m., going back to bed after my daughter's 1 a.m. feeding, which is when I started trying to get her to sleep in her own room, I heard loud, evenly spaced footsteps of what sounded like boots or heavy type shoes going up and down the hallway to my room. I laid there in my room for about 10 minutes listening to it, petrified that someone was in my house. My eyes were glued to the doorway, expecting the person to walk right into my room. Then it would go back down the hall and come back. A few minutes after the footsteps dissipated, which I chalked up to tree branches hitting the roof, I was startled again when I heard two distinct male voices having a conversation in my living room. It was so clear, like if I had been closer, I would have heard exactly what they were saying. It sounded like an older male, 50s, and a younger male, 20 or 30s. As soon as I stepped in the hallway, the voices stopped as fast as they had appeared. I looked out all the windows to see if maybe someone was taking a late-night stroll around the park. There was absolutely no one around. I also have discovered, living here now for a year, that when all the windows and doors are closed, it's impossible to hear someone speaking outside unless they are right at the window yelling, and then you can only hear them within maybe a 10-foot radius. So I've been able to dismiss that someone or someone's were talking or taking a walk. After that night, I brought my daughter back into the bedroom, and she stayed there until she outgrew the bassinet at 2.5 months old, and went back to sleeping in her own bedroom. A couple weeks later, I heard the footsteps again. Then the next night, the male voices were there again. In November, I started getting my hair pulled whenever I was in the kitchen. It was like a playful tug, but it was firm enough for me to whip my head around to see who was doing it. There was never anyone behind me, or even close to me, except once. My husband and I were doing dishes together, and I was washing and he was rinsing, our usual pattern, and there was a hard tug on my ponytail, but it wasn't my husband because he had both hands in the sink, and even if it had been him, my hair would have been wet because his hands were wet, and it wasn't. I seriously thought that I was going insane, so I went to a doctor who had now put me on severe anti-anxiety meds. I also had PTSD from childhood abuse that has been contributed to a history of anxiety. While the meds have helped deal with my PTSD and anxiety attacks, the voices and footsteps disappeared for a little while. That is when I noticed weird orbs and wisps in about a third of the pictures of my daughter. The best one that I had was lost when my computer crashed 2 weeks ago. I'm so mad, but then got worse. Around February, I was reading in bed one night when all of a sudden there was a loud "hey" right in my ear. I even felt the heat of the breath on my ear and neck. I was home alone, except for my baby who was sleeping in her crib. I was really freaked out, but somehow I managed to finish the book I was reading and went to bed. At 2:30 a.m., I woke up to loud footsteps stomping up and down the hall. That went on for about 2 or 3 minutes. I eventually was able to fall asleep. I have heard the loud "hey" several times since. Every time it is followed briefly by the heavy footsteps in the hallway. I haven't had my hair tugged since December though. I have only heard the male voices in the living room a few times since, but that is because I am so paranoid that they will wake me up. I have been staying up until 3 a.m. to avoid the 2:30 a.m. wake up, "hey," and the following disturbances. I know that if it is something, it seems to be mostly residual, so I have nothing to be afraid of. I just don't like getting woken up hearing voices in my living room at 2:30 in the morning. It freaks me out and makes me think someone is in the house. Any suggestions how I can deal with this without taking a sleeping pill? I really would appreciate any suggestions or any comments anyone has. Thank you. Story 6. While living in the state of Maine, my 2 sons and I headed up the road to look in an old apple orchard to shoot a deer. Outside the orchard was an old stone home. Across from it was a fallen down barn. The boys and I walked over to the old barn. There was some snow on the ground, not a whole lot. As we got directly across from the driveway of the house, we could see the trees out back. Behind the trees was a large pond. Something caught my eye in the side window of the house. It was a large woman in an apron, leaning on the table there and smiling at us. I told the boys we should go and ask her if it was all right to cut through her yard to go behind into the orchard. We walked around the street and knocked on the door, noticed immediately that there was no furniture in the house. I walked around to the side window. There was an old table there in front of the window, all dusty with no hand marks, where the woman had been leaning. Also, no footprints around the house in the snow. We saw her for quite some time before crossing the dirt road. She was there, but not a real person at all. She was a real ghost. We later learned that the house was empty because of this woman who had haunted it for many years. The house had been torn down. No one could ever live in it. It was in Fryeburg, Maine. There was one very haunted house near Bridgeton, Maine, about 8 miles from this one. The owner offered $100 to anyone who could spend the night in it. No one ever did while I lived up there. Story 7. Have you ever been so scared out of your mind before? I have, and this is exactly what happened to me the night I probably will never forget. It was around 8 o'clock. It was getting dark. My neighbor tripped me and I fell to the ground. I laid there as he walked away. I kept trying to scare my little sister, my neighbor, and my 2 little cousins all night long, so I got up from where I was laying and knocked on the window. They knew it was me, so after a while I got bored of knocking, then ran back to go lay down in the damp grass. I got up and walked over to go inside when I saw this bright glowing white light across from me go as fast as it could across my grandparents' field. Whatever it was, it had a glowing white body with an old-styled hat with a bow tied around it. After I saw it, I was in shock, so I kind of just stopped. After realizing I had just seen the supernatural, I ran for the basement door crying. I told my grandfather, and he said he had seen a ghost once when he was younger, which he had lived in the house next door, being my great-grandmother's for years. I was so freaked out, I don't go back out that way during the night. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed.